Hi guys, welcome to Medical Science. This is my YouTube page. I'm a former master's in biomedical sciences and a TB, 2B DDS. I'm a third year going on my fourth year dental student at University of Michigan, and I just wanted to kind of make a page where I talked about some topics in biomedical sciences that particularly interested me. I feel like I have a pretty strong hold in the field, so I wanted to make this page, and this kind of applies to any dental student, medical students. I'm going to make this as comprehensive as possible, and I just wanted to start off with something basic today, just to see how things go. Thanks so much. Hope you enjoy. Okay, so let's start over here by talking about the first topic that I want to discuss in cardiac physiology, and that is the pressure volume loops. Okay, so essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over what a pressure volume loop basically looks like, and the key factors that I want to discuss that can impact it, whether it be in a physiological or a pathological condition, and I'll mostly focus on the physiology because once you understand that, the pathology kind of follows in place, and that would be the preload, the afterload, and the contractility. Okay, so let's start by getting our pressure volume loop here up on the screen now. We've got it right there. So essentially what we're seeing here is that we've got this loop, and on the y-axis we've got the left ventricular pressure. Okay, we've got the left ventricular pressure, and on the x-axis we've got the left ventricular volume. And in between, so we've got this end systolic volume right here, and then we've got the end diastolic volume right here. So what happens is, as the cardiac cycle runs, the heart, after the end of the contraction, basically the aortic valve is going to close right here, and as the valve closes, the ventricle begins relaxation, and this is called the starting period of that relaxation, when there's no blood coming in because the pressure in the left ventricle is greater than the pressure coming in from our venous system. Therefore, this part is called the isovolumetric relaxation. Okay, so this is the part where there's no change in volume, and the ventricle is relaxing. Then, as the pressure starts to drop down, you start to see the ventricle, the mitral or tricuspid valves, they start to open. In this case, since we're talking about the left ventricle, we'll be referring to the mitral valves. As they open, the blood from the pulmonary system begins to slowly fill up our ventricle, and towards the end of that part we get what's called the atrial systole. So the atria, when the sinoatrial node sort of kicks off the electrical current, it gives it a little bump of atrial systole, and we end up finally at our end diastolic volume. Then, now that we've got our pressure built up in the ventricle, we've got our full diastolic volume, which is our end diastolic volume, then we reach a phase that is called the isovolumetric contraction. Isovolumetric contraction. Okay, so similar to the relaxation here, you have no change in volume, but your ventricle is beginning to contract and create that back pressure on the blood for the blood to ultimately start flowing out into your systemic circulation in the case of the left ventricle, or into the pulmonic circulation in the case of your right ventricle. Okay, so the back pressure starts building up. Ultimately, you reach a pressure that's greater than the pressure in the aorta. The aortic valve flips open, blood flows out, and ends up into our systemic circulation, and the cycle sort of continues. So that right there is a basic breakdown of the cardiac cycle and what a pressure volume loop is basically trying to show you. So let's move on talking about our first example, which is of the preload. So in our preload, what happens is a preload is an indication of your end diastolic volume. Essentially, it's an indication of your end diastolic volume. Now, what is the end diastolic volume? Basically, it's the point at which the end of diastole, when your myocardium It's stretched out, it's filled with blood, and at that point, if you recall the Frank-Starling mechanism, this is something I can cover in a later video if you guys would like, but basically, the Frank-Starling mechanism basically states that it's the amount of stretch that's placed during filling on the ventricular myocardium, and based on the amount of stretch you're allowed to, the myocardium is able to build up a contractile force. Ultimately, that system can be overwhelmed. That contractile force can start to diminish. In pathological states like a systolic dysfunction during heart failure, that's essentially what happens, and that Frank-Starling curve is compromised, and we used drugs and different mechanisms to overcome that and try to move that Frank-Starling curve upwards, to shift it up and to the left. But anyways, let's stick to our conversation here. So preload, like all things, can go up or it can go down. Some things that can make the preload go up would be things like exercise, a decrease in heart rate, or a secondary to an increased afterload. Now, what does all this mean, right? So exercise, how is this happening? So during exercise, there's several things that are going on mechanistically, but one of the things that's happening is an increase in preload. You also, due to the ramp up in the sympathetic nervous system activity, you also have an increase in the contractility of the heart. One of the things that's going on is that you have an increase in your venous return to the heart, and that's happening because the sympathetic nervous system is causing an increase in contraction of your venous system, and as a result, more blood is returning to the heart, and that's increasing your preload. The other thing that can impact it and cause an increase in preload is a decrease in heart rate. Why does that happen? Well, that results in a increase in filling time for your ventricle. By decreasing the heart rate, you increase the fill time for the ventricle. It gives more time for that ventricle to fill up with blood. In addition to that, you have a secondary to an increased afterload. Well, an afterload, which we'll go over in the next set of slides, is essentially what an afterload is the pressure that you have to go against. It's the pressure in your systemic circulation, in your aortic vasculature, or in your pulmonic system when you have pulmonary hypertension. That afterload is a pressure that the ventricle has to push against to get the blood out, because everything moves based on gradients. You're going from high to low, the movement of blood. So to fire against that pressure, to fire against that afterload, you need to push. Now, if all things stay constant here, like your heart rate, well, your fill time is going to remain constant, and as a result, what's going to happen is your end diastolic volume is going to increase. Your end diastolic volume will ultimately increase because you're going to pump less blood out, you're going to have a greater end systolic volume, and you'll ultimately end up with a higher end diastolic volume. And one thing, and the example that I have here on our slide is an example of an increase in end diastolic volume. When you increase that preload, you're able to pump out, all things remaining constant, you're able to pump out a greater volume of blood as a result, giving you a higher increase in stroke volume. So increased preload equals increase stroke volume due to an increase in your end diastolic volume. Now, some things that can decrease it would be a venous vasodilator, like a drug that would cause dilation of your veins, like nitroglycerin, which is something that we use as a symptomatic treatment for people with anginal symptoms. We use venous vasodilators. This decreases the demand on the heart. So by decreasing the oxygen, or by decreasing the blood to the heart, we decrease the myocardial oxygen demand, and that actually helps anginal patients kind of compensate, kind of deal with their symptoms, at least for the time being. So that is nitroglycerin. Moving on, so that was an example of how preload can increase end diastolic volume, ultimately giving you a greater stroke volume. Okay, let's talk now a little bit about afterload. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this. So afterload, like I was mentioning before, is our essentially the back pressure that the ventricle has to pump against. So what can happen in an increased afterload, which is an example of which is hypertension, a classic silent killer that many Americans and people across the world deal with. We have a lot of medications to combat this, a lot of issues, a lot of things that comorbidities that are associated with it. So obviously something that concerns us greatly, and a lot of treatment that kind of goes into this. But anyways, hypertension, that's one of the things that causes the thickening of your vasculature. Ultimately, what it does is it makes it so that the heart has to pump a greater amount of pressure to get the same blood out, and as a result it has to have a greater of this isovolumetric contraction that we talked about earlier. You have to have more isovolumetric contraction to get the blood out. Ultimately, since the heart rate is staying constant, we're assuming per this model, since the heart rate is staying constant, you end up with a increase in systolic volume. Increase with your end systolic volume because you're not able to get as much blood out within that one beat at that time, so you end up with a greater end systolic volume, things fill up, and you begin the cardiac cycle again. And as you can see, hypertension, higher blood pressures, you're operating at higher pressures here. So your system kind of adapts and it starts to operate at higher pressure. Something that can decrease the afterload is a drug like hydralazine, which is a arterial vasodilator. Now, there are drugs like ACE inhibitors that we can use that affect both the preload and the afterload, and that's why I'm not using that as an example here, but those are also more commonly used drugs than this, and this is a sole arterial vasodilator that's used, and it reduces the afterload. So that increase in afterload has a multiple stepwise set of things that can occur with it. In terms of increasing the pressure, that increase in the pressure, according to the law of Laplace, creates an increase in wall tension, and the left ventricle has methods that it does to compensate for that increase in wall tension, and the way it compensates is by hypertrophy, and that's why you see these cases of ventricular hypertrophy over time in a patient that has hypertension, which increases myocardial oxygen demand on the myocardium as well, and that can create problems down the road. Okay, and now we'll talk about our last example, which is going to be the contractility. So we kind of mentioned this briefly earlier when we were talking about our exercise example in terms of dealing with things. And contractility can be affected, obviously, now by exercise, which in particular the increase in that sympathetic nervous system activity due to the catecholamines that are involved in that pathway. Now we won't go into the details of how the catecholamines kind of trigger the cascade of events, but you'll just have to take my word for it, and it's something we can talk about down the road. Then there's also a drug which they use commonly on heart failure patients acutely, digitalis, to get their heart going. A decrease in contractility can result from our famous hypertension drugs, which are the beta blockers. Now, the example that I've used in our PV loop here is of a increased contractility. So basically what's going on here is due to the increase in contractility, our end diastolic volume here stays the same, but our end systolic volume is decreasing. Our end systolic volume is decreasing because what's happening is the myocardium, everything is constant. The amount of blood there is constant, everything is constant, but what's going on is there's a greater force that's generated, behind that blood, and as a result of that greater force that's generated, more blood is pushed out of the left ventricle at the end of that contraction. At the end of our contraction, more blood is pushed out, and as a result, we have a lower end systolic volume. We have a lower end systolic volume, which ultimately results in a greater stroke volume when you have an increase in contractility. Finally, I just want to thank everyone for listening and watching my video today. If you get a moment, please subscribe to my page. Hopefully we'll be able to come up with more content based on the feedback that I get from you guys. I'm really excited about this opportunity. This time has kind of given me a lot of chance to reflect, and this is something I've looked forward to doing for a while. To kind of end, I just want to take this time to thank our frontline healthcare workers and anybody else that's working on the front lines. This is a really noble feat that they're doing, so we just want to take a moment to thank them. All right now, take care.